Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Smithsonian Technology Cafe. I'm so excited to be here with you today. This conversational session is going to focus on tips for using digital museum resources and a free online platform, the Smithsonian Learning Lab, to support student learning from educators who are experienced in doing so in a variety of environments. My name is Tess, and I am an educator at the Smithsonian Office of Educational Technology, a central education office here at the Smithsonian. I'm a white woman with dark brown hair pulled into a ponytail, and I'm wearing a muted orange shirt. During this session, I'm going to be joined off screen by two of my colleagues, Darren Milligan and Stephanie Greenhut. They're going to be helping us out in the Q&A. We are very lucky to be joined by three fantastic educators who are going to share their experiences and guest tips for using digital museum resources for learning. They are Sher Petty, who is an education consultant at Anderson Petty Consultants. She is also incredibly experienced in teaching literature at the high school level in Montgomery College Public Schools in Maryland. We're also joined today by Eveleen Eaton, who is a literacy and math support teacher at Sidwell Friends School, an elementary school in Washington, D.C. And we're also joined by Jason Smith, who is a civics teacher at Avonworth Middle School, located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. During today's session, they're going to be sharing with us a lot of really great resources and tips. So our objectives for today's session are as follows. We want you to leave with transferable teaching techniques, models for developing learning experiences, and lessons learned from classroom educators in using digital museum resources for learning. We also want you to leave with ideas for using the Learning Lab to translate Education Summit ideas to your classroom. So to get there, we're going to do a few different things together today. I'm going to start off with a quick introduction to the Smithsonian Learning Lab, what it is and how it works. We'll then transition over to a conversation with our guest educators, and then we'll end with an open conversation where our guests and I will answer your questions. This is going to be supported by the Q&A feature of the event platform. So if you have questions at any time, plug it into the Q&A. We'll answer as many questions as we can during this closing portion of our session. So with that, let's dive into the Smithsonian Learning Lab. Let's go to the next slide. Here, you're seeing a screenshot of the Smithsonian Learning Lab homepage with the URL of the Learning Lab, learninglab.si.edu, located underneath. The Smithsonian Learning Lab is a free platform designed for teachers and students to discover digital museum resources from across the Smithsonian and beyond, the creation of interactive learning experiences, and the sharing of discoveries and creations with others. Users do not need a free account to discover and use resources on the site, but if they do, they can create learning experiences of their own. Let's move to the next slide. So on the Learning Lab, you can discover resources from all the Smithsonian's museums and centers. These include things like objects, artwork, and photographs, as well as primary source documents, video and audio recordings, websites, and more. On the next slide, we're going to see with a short video an example of what a resource in the Learning Lab looks like. These resources often take the form of high-resolution images that you can flip through and zoom into in detail. If we could move to the next slide with the video, you'll see a demonstration of me navigating through one of these resources, and importantly, clicking on the information button, which will highlight information about the resource from the museum that holds it. Why don't we move to the next slide, or here, if the quick animation can play. And if not, that's fine. We can move over to the next slide. Perfect, thank you. So here you see me zooming in, navigating through images, and opening up that information panel where you'll find authoritative information about the resource from the museum that holds it. On the next slide, Learning Lab collections can take many different forms, and there are tools to help you do so. Importantly, you can add interactivity, you can bring in external resources, and you don't have to start from scratch in creating collections. You can copy and adapt a collection that someone else has created to fit your learning needs. So if you're inspired by a collection that one of our guests shares today, but you want to make some changes to fit your own classroom needs, you can do so right in the platform. On the next slide, and if we could play the video here, this is an example of what a Learning Lab collection looks like. And every collection looks a little bit like this. You'll find the title at the top with the author's name and a link to their profile below. This is followed by a description that explains what this collection contains and how it can be used. Resources are the heart of a collection and are shown here as image thumbnails. Paperclip icons in the upper left corner of resources show that the author has added some sort of interactivity here, and I can click on any of these resources to view that in detail. So let's do that here. Here I can see the author has added text to provide instructions to a student and hotspots to highlight and annotate areas of interest on this image. And then finally, if we can move forward to the next slide, you can use the Learning Lab to share your discoveries and creations with others. If you'd like to continue learning how to use the lab, there are a few resources that will support you in moving forward. If we move to the next slide, you'll see a screenshot of the Learning Lab Help Center, which includes step-by-step instructions on how to do everything on the lab, as well as videos from educators sharing their favorite teaching techniques. The URL for this page is shown here at the bottom of the slide, but you'll also find links to this page at the bottom of every page on the Learning Lab. Just look for the button that says Help. In addition, we've created a video for the summit that we hope will help you in getting started on the Learning Lab. It's called Dig into Digital with the Smithsonian Learning Lab, and you can find it on the bonus content tab of the event platform. This short video provides a brief tutorial on how to get started. Of course, we've also uploaded our slides for the session to the event platform. There you'll find embedded links to everything we're showing today. You can search the Learning Lab for all the collections that we'll be sharing, but those links will help you get to them quickly. So with that, I would love to get started talking to one of our guests here today, Eveleen Eaton. I'd like to welcome you to the stage. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Tess. So to give a visual description first, I'm a white woman. I have short brown hair and I'm wearing a green shirt with a silver layered necklace and silver earrings. And I'm sitting in a room that has many pictures on the wall behind me. So my name is Eveleen Eaton and I'm a teacher at Sidwell Friends Lower School here in Washington, D.C. I'm currently the second grade literacy and math support teacher, and I've also taught first, third, and fourth grade. I've been using the Learning Lab since I was introduced to it in 2018 when I was a fellow at the Smithsonian National Museum of Asian Art, and that is also when I met Tess.
Eve, I'm so glad that you could join us today and share some of the ways that you've been using digital museum resources with your students for years. So the first question I would love to ask you is, how do you use those digital museum resources with your students?
Thanks. So what I usually do is I start with a unit or a part of the curriculum that I know really well and I feel could be enhanced by the use of digital resources. So if you can go to the next slide. On the screen is a collection that I built for a geometry unit within third grade. And we were learning about shapes and lines and angles and symmetry. And I went into the lab looking for some objects that could deepen my students' understanding of these concepts. And you can see that I found a lot of examples here with that little video. And that's something that I like to do is I like to find a lot of examples. So I have many possibilities when I'm actually using this collection with my students. And the reason why I look for a lot of examples is it's a way to connect better with the students. It's another way to connect with the students. If the students see something that's from their background or from their culture, hopefully they're going to get excited about it and be willing to take those risks that we would like them to take. So when we dive into looking at resources on the Learning Lab collections, that is usually our jumping off point, and we oftentimes do something with it after that. So we start in the Learning Lab and then we go offline. So if you go to the next slide, we took that collection of textiles and then we thought about the shapes and lines and angles and symmetry a little bit more as we were looking at them in those textiles. We made our own objects that had symmetry in them and other things that we were looking at. And then we used those to then print them on paper as a stamp, to print them on paper in a quilt or textile-like pattern. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that project, there will be a link in the slides that Tess mentioned earlier. And one of the things that I love about using the Learning Lab in my classroom as a resource is that you can get inspired by other teachers. When I was looking for objects to use for this particular idea, I happened to find a high school teacher that was also thinking about using textiles in geometry, and I was inspired by that teacher. He did use it as at the high school level, so I had to change it to fit my context of third grade. But that is something that I really love, is that you can connect with educators across the world.
Thanks for sharing that, Eve. My next question for you is there a teaching technique that you found especially helpful, or a couple teaching techniques that you use often?
Yeah, if we can go to the next slide. My go-to thinking routine is See, Think, Wonder. I think that this is such a good grounding routine for a lot of reasons. It helps your group slow down, really look at the object and reflect on it. See, Think, Wonder is a routine that can be used on its own, and but I often like to pair it with another routine that would maybe get at another kind of thinking that I would like my students to do at that time. So the piece that you're looking at here, Tess and I actually used in a presentation with adults last year, and it's called Wedding Souvenirs, and it's by Njideka Akunili Crosby. And we started with See, Think, Wonder, and then we moved on to a routine that was thinking about perspectives. When we're thinking about using routines, we often go to the Project Zero toolbox. And you can see there that when you go to that toolbox, it gives you lots of different types of thinking that you could be doing. And when you go into each of those boxes, there are lots of routines that can help you kind of piece out what exactly part of perspectives, what exactly part of global thinking might you want to be doing with your students, and what's going to get to the conversations that you're hoping for. So those are two things that we use all the time.
Those are two of my favorite routines, and See, Think, Wonder is so transferable. It's a really great way to help students just start looking. I'd love to know, how do you begin building a Learning Lab collection?
All right, so if we could go to the next slide. This is a screenshot of my collections page. So if you do sign up for a free Learning Lab account, you will have on your dashboard a page of collections, and you can see that I have 14 published collections and I have 10 unpublished collections. And what I usually do when I start building a collection is I start with that topic or unit or person that I've been inspired by. And I start looking around in the lab at resources and at collections that others have made to see what's out there and to see what I might want to bring into my classroom. And once I do that and I start collecting a lot of things, I then also kind of dip in and out of that Project Zero toolbox and think about what routines are going to match the things that I want, the kinds of thinking that I want my students to be engaging in. And I put all of those tiles together. The Learning Lab does have a whole collection of the Project Zero routines so you have all the steps right there and you can put it into your collection. So then everything is there in one place. And the final step that I do when I'm starting to build my collection is I find the Learning Lab resources, I find those thinking routines that I want to use, and then I might upload any kind of recording sheets or other materials that I might have my students use which is something that you can do in the Learning Lab. And I have it all together so that I know when I go back to that collection, I'll have everything that I was thinking about using at the time. And if we can go on to the next slide. My last step that I do before I publish a collection is I really think about the description that I want to put on to that collection. And the description helps other users find what you have made because you can tag it by subject level, by age level, by user, if it's a teacher resource or a student resource or a little bit of both. And then you can put in a big description of how you used it in your classroom to give other educators a sense of what you were doing at the time. And I really feel like this is probably the most important step before you publish something, because then you're able to help others with the work that you have done.
I think that's a really important point. And just to reiterate, you have the option of publishing these interactive learning experiences, these collections you create on the platform for other educators to access and use, and learners too, and providing information on what you're thinking, how you intend on this being used is a really important part of making sure it's usable by others. So I really appreciate that tip, Eve. My last question for you is, do you have any final tips you'd like to share with us?
Yes, I would say take your time. I've been using the Learning Lab since 2018, and it does take some time to find the resources that are interesting to you to use in your context for the group of students that's in front of you, because a collection that works one year might not really be the thing that will work the next year. So take your time and give yourself the space and grace to build it to what you want it to be. You don't have to publish it. You don't have to share it with others unless you really want to. So give yourself the time. That would be my first step, my first tip. My second tip would be to really look at what other educators have done. There's amazing work in the Learning Lab. There's all kinds of thinking on all different levels, and don't be afraid to look outside of your teaching level. So as an elementary teacher, yes, I'm drawn to other elementary teachers, but I have found inspiration in middle and high school teachers as well. And I've heard from other teachers that you can go any way because you just modify it for your context. And my last tip is a very simple one, but one that I learned by default is favorite the things that you really like. Collections and resources within collections. I wasted a lot of time at first by not favoriting. There's a little heart on the edge of all of the different collections and resources that will save it to your dashboard. Because if you go back and you try to think about what was I searching for when I saw that really interesting thing that I would like to use now, it might take some time to figure that out. But if you favorite it, it's there. And you can see that I have favorited a lot of things. This is my favorites page.
Thank you so much, Eve. And if we can move to the next slide, I've got a screenshot of Eve's profile page here and a link. If you follow that link, you can go right to Eve's profile page to see the collections that she shared today and all of the other great learning experiences that she has developed and is sharing with other educators to adapt and use. Before we move on to the next speaker, I'd just love to remind all of you, if you have a question for any of our panelists as they're sharing content today, please share that in the Q&A. We'll get to it during the open conversation at the end. Eve, thank you so much again. With that, I'd love to welcome Jason Smith onto the stage. Jason, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tess. And Eve, I just got to say, you're such a creative and thoughtful educator. Your students are lucky to have somebody like you in the elementary level. And then when they come up to me in the high school, they're going to be even better for it. My name is Jason Smith. I'm coming to you from the suburbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm a white male. I've got brown hair. I've got probably 3 or 4 days of a beard that I think might be growing, and I'm wearing a green shirt. But again, I teach 8th grade ELA Civics in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at a school called Avonworth Middle School.
Thank you so much, Jason. So I'd like to ask the same first question of you. How do you use digital museum resources with your students?
Well, on the previous slide, I sort of organized my class in the ideas that I'm trying to develop citizenship skills in these young adults. And what do I mean by that? They're not old enough to vote. They feel somewhat powerless in the grand scheme of things, but I'm trying to let them see that they can influence things that are happening in our country. And I'm trying to get them to have respect for our country, but also for one another. And when you have to tackle controversial subjects in a civics classroom, like the Second Amendment and race and court decisions and voting, you have to make sure that you're using reliable sources. And you have to make sure that you're getting accurate information. And that's where the Smithsonian Learning Lab has been so helpful in my classroom. And one collection that I'm going to highlight today is the Second Amendment collection. And in Western Pennsylvania, where I teach and where I live, we are very politically diverse. And some might look at that as a challenge. I look at that as an opportunity because in my classroom, I've had students come back and tell me about their experience at a Bernie Sanders political rally, and I've had students tell me about the gun store that their parents own. And people come into our classroom with very, very strong opinions all over the political map. And when we get into the actual assignments and we get into the civic discourse, I need to make sure that not only are the students grounding their arguments and opinions in evidence, that as their teacher, I'm providing fair, accurate information for them to use. And that's where the Smithsonian Learning Lab is giving me that background and that foundation that I know is going to be legit. And I know it's been researched, and it's going to be something that if and when, and this has happened, parents or school board members want to see where I'm getting my sources and making sure that I don't have any hidden political agendas, I can always turn them back to the Smithsonian's website and show them that this is legit stuff that we're doing. And I don't know that there's a more controversial subject right now than the Second Amendment. So that is the collection that I'm going to talk with you a little bit about today, and how I've used the Smithsonian Learning Lab to kind of help approach this very delicate subject.
So in approaching these types of difficult topics and starting conversations, but also welcoming diverse perspectives, are there any teaching techniques that you found especially helpful?
Yeah, what I like to do is, again, teaching 13 and 14-year-old students, I need to find some connection. Not everybody in my class is somebody who is a hunter or has experience handling guns. And there may be many students in my class who have families who are very opposed to having any guns in their homes. But one thing that a lot of my students do have are stickers on their laptops and stickers on their cell phones or buttons on their jackets or on their backpacks. So I try to find something like that, where they have chosen to put these stickers and buttons on their property because they want to send a message. And it's a great opportunity to connect a thinking routine, the See, Think, Wonder, which Eve has mentioned she also uses in her classroom, for them to start to analyze, well, why did they choose the particular, office or Stranger Things sticker for their laptop? Or why did they choose their favorite sports team for their cell phone? But now we can connect it to the actual content. Looking at some of the resources in the Smithsonian Learning Lab, we can see that these buttons and these stickers have been around for a long time. And we can start to think about what is the message that the people that are wearing them or displaying them trying to send? And what can we wonder about their goals for this country or for legislation that might be proposed in Congress? And it's something very tangible. It's something that students can see out in the community. It's something that they can even analyze the words and the imagery, and in my case, make their own buttons or make their own stickers. We're fortunate enough to have a maker space and some teachers that kind of help us with that. But I really think that the See, Think, Wonder, pairing the thinking routine along with the resources that are in the lab, It's very easy too to add your own. I think in the 4 examples that I showed, 2 were in the Learning Lab, 2 I added just from other resources that I've gathered over my years of teaching. And you treat them just the same. They all kind of live in that collection. And then you allow the students to kind of make their own, I guess, inferences from those.
Mhm. That is super helpful. And my follow-up question is, how do you start the brainstorming process of figuring out what the learning experiences that you want to build and beginning to turn that into a learning lab collection?
Yeah, I'm a planner, as most teachers are. We really kind of have to be a planner, or we're going to sink some days. But I like to plan with the end in mind. It's called backwards design, and I really like to think that at the end of this unit, at the end of our study of the Second Amendment, what do I want students to do? I don't want to just list off facts and statistics. That's not teaching. I want to empower my students to take what I have provided them, come up with some sort of argument, and then go out and do something about it. And when I talk about students having agency, it's about them being an active participant in our classroom, but also in our country by taking action. And in this case, in this particular collection, taking a side and actually getting their ideas out through the other parts in the collection. You'll see there's significant research and analysis of both sides of the Second Amendment. Many of those resources direct from the Learning Lab. But not just having the conversation in a classroom, not just turning in a paper there, I'm going to be the only one who reads it. I actually require that my students write a formal letter to a member of Congress, and that they will have to identify first, who our sitting member of Congress is, find out their address, and then write a letter where they're giving the evidence and the statistics and the research that they've gathered, and telling that congressperson, here is where I want you to vote on this next proposed gun control legislation, or this is why I want you to defend the Second Amendment. This is what I feel and I believe. I mean, I'm a social studies teacher, but this is a great opportunity for the writing process to come into play, where we can do some peer editing. We can work with the English teacher. We can work with the learning support and the gifted education teachers to make sure that students all have the scaffolding or the opportunities they need to get those letters out there. Plus the real world skills. I've had students who this is the first time they've actually addressed an envelope. So just learning that as well is something that I think is an important part of being a citizen. But I got to say, one of the coolest parts, thinking about the end, is when those students get a response in the mail. And that's the thing about writing to your senator or writing to your congressperson. Like 99% of the time, they will reply. It might just be a standard form letter, but it's still cool for this 13 or 14-year-old to get a letter in the mail. And in our case, this past school year, we actually did get a letter from our member of Congress. His name is Connor Lamb. And not only did he reply to the students and thank them for being an engaged citizen, but he also had a flag flown over the Capitol. And that flag was then sent to us. It's on display in my classroom. And it was just a really cool experience for our students to see that, yes, they're 13 years old, but they have made an impact. Their words, their research has gotten all the way to the halls of Congress. And I wouldn't have been able to do that without the Smithsonian Learning Lab giving them the resources to help get them there.
What an amazing way for your students to see the impact that their voices can have. My last question for you is, do you have any final tips for educators attending this session?
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to say that when you are thinking about, as a teacher, what you want your students to be able to do with information, I always want to think about authentic audiences and the impact that you can have with them outside of your classroom. Even if they're creating a book or a story, or even teaching students in a younger grade, or making a website, if they're getting it out there, then they are being that engaged citizen, and they are being an influence on others. And I think that's what we want all of our kids to be. And the Smithsonian Learning Lab, again, it's going to give you that resource that you need to make sure the information you're providing is reliable and accurate.
That was all so helpful. Thank you, Jason, for sharing all of your experiences talking about these topics with your students. If you're interested in seeing Jason's collection or any of the other collections that he's created, again, on the screen, you're seeing a link to his profile page. The slideshow is also embedded in the event platform, and throughout that slideshow, we've embedded links to everybody's collections. And I saw that was a question that came through the Q&A. If you want to access what they've created, check out the slideshow. You can also search the Learning Lab by the names of their collections to find what they've created. Last but not least, I would love to welcome Sher Anderson-Petty to the stage. Sher, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, to give you a visual description of myself, I am a Black woman. I have a silver superhero streak, and I'm wearing a rose quartz necklace, and I'm wearing a coral colored dress. So thanks, Eve and Jason, for the wonderful representation of the Smithsonian Learning Lab. Thank you, Tess, and the National Education Summit staff for inviting me. I'm a fourth generation public school educator with 27 years experience teaching secondary English and 20 years experience writing curriculum and teaching teachers. I'm super excited to share how I use Smithsonian digital resources in the classroom.
Fantastic. So why don't we dive into that first topic, Sher? How do you use them with your students?
Well, in three ways: to help center students' cultural backgrounds and ethnocenters in all of our explorations, to help learners access content that supports cross-disciplinary connections, and to help learners practice dispositional thinking using visible thinking routines.
Fantastic. So going to those thinking routines, what types of teaching techniques have you found especially helpful?
Well, I use a combination of things. I use big understandings, Smithsonian Learning Lab collections, and visible thinking routines. When I think of the collection that I'm sharing today, the Resistance collection, Resistance was a big understanding we explored in IB literature through Toni Morrison's Beloved. And in this process, we were trying to help correct some common misconceptions. Oftentimes students see the small degree of diversity that we presently have in curriculum as a sign that we are somehow post-racial. Secondly, it's to help learners conceptualize intersectionality. This collection is designed to help students construct meaning around the intersection of Black women as makers of and subjects in literature and art, and the ubiquity of the white male gaze in various canons. And lastly, to introduce the idea of creative authenticity. I mean, when we think of Toni Morrison, the great Toni Morrison, think of her professional ethos. In her writing, it was that her sovereignty and authority as a racialized person must be struck immediately. And Morrison gave us the blueprint for not speaking for Black people, but speaking to and being among Black people. So her determination to make sure that the white gaze was not the dominant one in any of her works is an example of the importance and power of authentic creation.
Awesome. I would love to go to the next slide where I know that we have a short video of this collection that you're speaking about. And in this video, we can get a quick peek at some of the rich resources that you've pulled together here. One of the things I love about this collection is the diversity of artworks that you've pulled in and how you use them as such rich topics for conversation.
Well, the collection that we're looking at, Art and Resistance, it's near and dear to my heart. You know that when we were working together in the Museums Go Global project a few years ago, I just fell in love with these ideas. In this collection, we use visible thinking routines. It's really important. We use them as a tool, we use them as a structure, and we use them as a pattern of behavior. So what I mean by a tool is when you call for a carpenter and they're supposed to be, hitting a nail in, they're not going to get something other than a hammer. And it's the same idea in the classroom. So we have to determine the kind of thinking that we're trying to elicit from our students. And then we have to select the right tool, which in this case is the thinking routine for the job. Secondly, as a structure, there's 3 to 4 steps in each routine, and it follows a progression or scaffolding, if you will. And each step kind of builds on and extends the thinking of the previous one. And then lastly, as a pattern of behavior, in the context of the classroom, our objective is to create a culture of thinking. And routines are at that point sort of shared scripts. So as an example, think of actors, right? Actors use scripts, and over time they become independent from those scripts. It's the same with the thinking routines in the classroom with students.
That is so helpful, Sharon. I think you're already starting to touch upon this, but I would love to learn more about your process of building some of these learning experiences. It sounds like you do a lot with integrating these patterns of thinking, these structures, these tools, and tying them to some wonderfully rich visual works. But how do you get started in that process?
Well, first, I typically like to identify the kind of dispositional thinking that I'd like learners to practice. So in this case, it would have been based on the IB curriculum, state and local standards, Maryland State Department of Education, Montgomery County Public Schools. Then secondly, I identified the big understandings that I'd like learners to explore, because the concept has to offer some insights into how the world works and inform actions, as Jason was saying, and foster ethical attitudes and present opportunities to think deeply. And then I use the Smithsonian Learning Lab for related resources from existing collections. That's one of the amazing pieces of this, that if you are like me and you're sort of starting from your goals that are sometimes handed to you by your curriculum, you know what you're looking for. And when you go to the Smithsonian Learning Lab, you really can plug in search words, time periods, names of individuals you're looking for, and you can find people who have already created amazing collections already. And always remember to give credit to the original content creator in your citation. And then lastly, I also search, in addition to the Learning Lab, I search Smithsonian Museum websites for their digital resources. So the Learning Lab and the various digital resources at all of the Smithsonian museums create so much for us in the classroom.
That's fantastic, Sher. And my final question for you is going to be the same as the one I shared with Eve and Jason. Do you have any final tips for educators watching?
Well, it's tough to follow Eve and Jason because they really covered the waterfront in their responses. Thanks, guys. But I would say that we should all be students of our students, right? I'm sort of borrowing from David Perkins from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, but truly be a student of your students. Sometimes in the classroom, I say to my students that we're both learners and teachers, and they always go, I'm not a teacher, I'm a student. And I'm like, no, you are my student. And you are also my teacher because you teach me what works, what doesn't work. Also, we all know this, but it bears repeating. Don't be a sage on the stage. Instead, be a guide on the side, facilitating life-worthy explorations that feel relevant and real to our students. And that's part of what I love about the Smithsonian Learning Lab, is that it really has its finger on the pulse, because we can find resources from any era, right? So yeah, don't be a sage on the stage. Instead, be a guide on the side.
Thank you so much for all of that, Sher. Like with even Jason, if you'd like to check out the collections that Sher has created, including the one that she shared today, but all of the other ones she shared, the link to her profile page is there on the screen. Again, this is hyperlinked in the slide version that you'll find on the platform. So with that, I would like to dive into our Q&A and welcome all of our guest speakers back to the virtual stage. And for those of you watching, if you have a question and haven't shared it in the chat yet, please feel free to do so. I'd like to start this conversation with a question for all three of you that's come from one of our viewers. They asked, what types of collections would you like to see museum educators create? And how are you using museum-created collections in your classrooms? So those Smithsonian or other institutions, and yes, Sher, please.
Me first. I can't say enough about the National Gallery of Art's work, which is not among the Smithsonian's, but they do have collections in the lab. Just so many amazing museums there. Native American Museum, the Arthur Sackler Museum, just the African American History and Culture Museum. There's just so much juicy information from each of those.
That is a great tip. Go ahead, Eve.
I have to piggyback on Sher and say that the collections that the museums put out are so incredible to use, and the way that the resources are laid out. I am thinking about a National Portrait Gallery collection about portraiture and what you can learn from that. As an elementary school teacher, we often start the year doing some kinds of self-portraits just to get students to start to think about who they are as a person and who they are in the group. And I know that I personally have used some of those collections that they have on portraiture, just because the variety of resources there can really inspire you.
And there's a really good one too. I'm just thinking, for my own classroom, we've got an election coming up here, looking at different tools that candidates have used, whether they be posters or bumper stickers, the whole like evolution of political propaganda. There's some really cool stuff out there to kind of see how candidates have got their message out to voters, over the last hundreds of years. So that's been useful for me as a civics teacher.
Got another question here that's targeted to Eve, but I'm sure Jason and Sher will also have some perspectives on this that I think would be really helpful. So Eve, the question is, it sounds like you're using primarily the Learning Lab as a place to create and store lesson plans. Is that accurate, or do you have students explore your collections independently?
So that's a great question. I personally have used it as a teacher resource, a teacher collection. So it is sort of a lesson planning thing for me. The Learning Lab does allow for students to have accounts, but at my school and with the age of children that I have, it's another platform that they have to log into, which sometimes isn't the best use of time. So if I do want students to use things, to use parts of the collection on their own, you're able to download the resources that you collect, and I either put them into a PDF form to send to their iPads, or I will print them out for them to actually have the physical copy, and then they can use them on their own. But I don't usually have students go into the lab in their own account, just simply because of the age of the students that I teach.
Can I tap on to that question?
Oh, please.
When we were most of us in virtual space in our classrooms, I did actually use the collections with learners, with my high school students at that time, and they actually did have accounts and all of that, and they found it helpful at the time when we were, all virtual.
And I've done both, where I might just allow the students to kind of explore the lab without an account. But in the past, I've also had students make their own accounts and make their own collections and kind of share out and teach one another. So again, that's one of the great things about the Learning Lab, is the flexibility it gives to teachers.
Thank you all for sharing your perspectives and experiences and how you kind of bring this digital thing that you've created and use it in a variety of ways with your students. The last question that we'll answer during this program is one that I can help with, and I think it's really important to address since so many of you talked about it. The question is, are the Project Zero thinking routines embedded in the Learning Lab, or is it something that's brought in by the teacher? And that's something I saw all three of you use in your collections. For those of you watching, those are embedded in the Learning Lab. If you do a search for Project Zero, one of the routines I think all three of you use is See, Think, Wonder. You'll find a tile that we created that breaks down not only the questions of the routine, but also provides tips for using it. There's also a great Learning Lab collection that we created and are working on updating soon that pulls all of those collections together into one place. With that, I would love to share just a few parting notes if we could go back to the slideshow. The first is, if you'd like to learn more about using the Learning Lab, don't forget our Help Center. It's located at the URL here on the screen. You'll also find a link to it at the bottom of every page on the Learning Lab. This is where you can find step-by-step tutorials on how to get started in the platform. There's also a video in the bonus content section of the event platform that provides a quick video tutorial on how to get started. And then if you'd like to get in touch with us, we would love to hear from you. If you'd like to get in touch with the Learning Lab team, use the help icon. It shapes like a gear at the bottom right of every page on the Learning Lab. It'll open up an option to contact us. And if you'd like to get in touch with our guest presenters, on the next slide, you're going to see contact information for all three of them, whether that is on social media, websites, or via email. I know they would love to hear from you as well. And with that, I would just like to extend a final huge thank you to Eveleen and Jason and Sher for sharing all of their experiences and using digital museum resources for learning. We are so lucky to have you share your thoughts and ideas with us, and I hope it was inspirational for all of you watching. With that, thank you for attending the first day of the summit, and we'll see you all again tomorrow. Thank you.